unmistakably exaggerated. A funny drawing doesn't seem particularly dangerous. At best, everyone has a laugh and moves on while some people might be offended. But for hundreds of years, that wasn't how the world saw it. This is the world of caricature. Publishers were fined. Sometimes, entire newspapers were shut down. Some caricaturists even found themselves behind bars. All because they exaggerated someone's face. So what made caricature so powerful? To answer that, we first need to understand what caricature actually is. Most people think it's simply drawing someone with an oversized nose, giant ears, or an impossibly long chin. But that's only the surface. In fact, a caricature isn't trying to make someone look different. Rather, it's trying to make them look more like themselves. The word caricature comes from the Italian verb caricare, meaning to load or to exaggerate. The artist takes the features that make a face instantly recognizable, perhaps a prominent forehead, heavy eyebrows, a confident grin, and pushes them far beyond reality. Oddly enough, the more those features are exaggerated, the easier the person often becomes to recognize. That's because our brains don't memorize every detail of a face. Instead, they latch onto what makes that face unique. Caricature exploits this quirk of human perception, turning identity itself into a visual shorthand. But caricature isn't really about appearances. It's about personality. Many people know Claude Monet as one of the most prominent impressionists. But not a lot of people know before he revolutionized the art world as an impressionist. A teenage Claude Monet made a lucrative living selling caricatures in Le Havre. It is said that 15 years old Monet sold witty, charcoal sketches of local bigwigs and celebrities for 10 to 20 francs each, signing them "Oh Monet." That's what makes caricature different from a portrait. A portrait asks, what does this person look like? A caricature asks, who is this person, really? And that is precisely why the powerful have always feared it. Long before photographs, television, or the internet, caricatures could shape public opinion faster than almost any other form of media. They made kings look foolish, politicians look corrupt, generals look incompetent. And once millions of people had laughed at those images, it became almost impossible to restore the dignity they had lost. So where did this strange art form come from? Who first realized that exaggeration could reveal truth better than realism? To answer that, we have to travel back more than 400 years, to Renaissance Italy, where a group of artists accidentally invented one of history's most subversive visual languages. The story of caricature doesn't begin with newspapers, or politics, or even comedy. Surprisingly, it begins in Renaissance Italy. Around the late 15th century, Europe was experiencing an artistic revolution. Painters and sculptors were obsessed with perfection, mastering anatomy, perspective, proportion, and realism like never before. Artists at this time were obsessed with creating the most lifelike faces and ideal beauty. But one artist decided to rebel against this trend. He would follow interesting-looking people around town for a whole day just to memorize their features and draw them accurately from memory. He sought to capture the entire spectrum of human form, which often resulted in extreme facial expressions and exaggerated parts that were memorable to him. This was Leonardo da Vinci. He filled pages of his notebooks with strange heads, men with impossibly long noses, oversized jaws, wrinkled brows, and exaggerated expressions. Today they are often called the grotesque heads. At first glance, they look almost comical. But Leonardo wasn't simply making fun of people. He was conducting an experiment. He believed that a person's face reflected their character. By pushing certain features beyond reality, he discovered something unexpected. Exaggeration could sometimes reveal personality more clearly than realism ever could. A proud man could be made prouder, a miser, greedier, A fool, more foolish, more human. It was an idea centuries ahead of its time. But Leonardo never gave this strange practice a name. That came nearly 100 years later. Around the 1590s, in the Italian city of Bologna, two brothers, Annibale and Agostino Caraxi, were teaching at their newly founded art academy. Their students spent long days studying ideal proportions and classical beauty. Yet, after lessons ended, something rather unusual happened. The brothers challenged their students to draw one another, only with every distinctive feature pushed to the extreme. A long nose became even longer. A broad forehead grew impossibly wide. Bushy eyebrows became enormous. The results were hilarious, but they were also instantly recognizable. Somehow, the less realistic the faces became, the easier they were to recognize. The Caraxi brothers called this exercise caricature, an Italian word meaning to load, to charge, or to exaggerate. From that word came the term we still use today, caricature. What began as an artistic exercise soon evolved into something much more powerful. Artists realized exaggeration wasn't just entertaining. It could communicate ideas almost instantly. Without writing a single sentence, an artist could suggest that someone was arrogant, vain, greedy, or ridiculous. And because the message relied on images rather than words, almost anyone could understand it. It spoke to the people of the time, rich and poor, educated and illiterate. Caricature had become a universal language. Another great Italian artist embraced this idea. The 17th century sculptor John Lorenzo Bernini, famous for creating some of the most breathtaking marble sculptures in history, also enjoyed sketching quick caricatures of friends, patrons, and fellow artists. With just a few confident lines, Bernini could capture a person's entire personality. Not every wrinkle, not every strand of hair, just the essence. It was proof that a caricature wasn't the opposite of a portrait. In many ways, it was a portrait stripped down to its most revealing truths. For nearly a century, however, caricature remained mostly an artist's amusement, shared inside studios, passed among friends, appreciated by a relatively small audience. That was about to change, because soon printing technology catches up with this new art form. Then caricature would leave the workshop and enter the streets, and become one of the most feared weapons in European politics. For almost a century, caricature remained largely an inside joke among those who knew. Even though they were amusing, the audience was small. Then, something extraordinary happened and everything changed. By the 18th century, Europe was in the middle of a printing revolution. Advances in engraving and etching allowed images to be reproduced in far greater numbers than ever before. Suddenly, a single drawing was no longer confined to an artist's workshop. Books were no longer a privilege for aristocrats and monarchy. It could be printed hundreds, sometimes thousands, of times and sold on busy streets for ordinary people to see. For the first time, satire had mass distribution. And with mass distribution came influence. No country embraced this more enthusiastically than England. London's print shops were overflowing with satirical images. Their windows became public galleries where crowds gathered, laughed, argued, and debated the latest political scandal. Not through newspaper editorials, but through pictures. One artist stood above the rest, James Gillray. Gillray understood something that politicians did not. People might forget a speech. They might skip a lengthy political essay. But a striking image may just be unforgettable. And that's exactly what he did. By reducing complicated politics to a single unforgettable image, caricature became a visual shortcut. You didn't need to understand government policy to recognize greed drawn as an oversized stomach, or arrogance exaggerated into an impossibly raised chin. One glance was enough, and once people laughed, the damage was already done. Soon, the idea spread across the English Channel. But nowhere did caricature become more dangerous than France. The 19th century was a turbulent time. Revolutions, changing governments, and public unrest reshaped the country almost every generation. In such an unstable political climate, images could ignite emotions far more quickly than speeches. Take this caricature from 1844, for example. J.J. Granville's The Great and the Small depicts unusually tall gentleman and lady in elegant clothes. Meanwhile, surrounding is short, almost squeezed-down people. One person even has to hold up a stick to hand the tall gentleman's hat, since it's impossible for him to reach him. This was a social commentary, mocking the rigid power dynamics, greed, and inequality of 19th-century European society by turning societal scale and visual perspective literally on its head. These unforgettable images can spread through a city in days, embedding itself in people's memories long after the words have been forgotten. But no one understood this better than the French artist Honoré Daumier. In December 1831, Daumier published what would become one of the most famous political caricatures in history. It was called Gargantua. The title referred to the giant from French literature, famous for his enormous appetite. But Daumier's giant wasn't fictional. The king sat atop a massive throne, his body swollen with excess. A wooden ramp stretched from the ground straight into his mouth. Along it, ordinary citizens struggled upward carrying bags of tax money. At the other end, honors, government positions, and privileges poured out behind the king, not back to the people who had paid for them, but to wealthy politicians and loyal supporters. No lengthy explanation was necessary. Anyone looking at the print immediately understood the accusation. After all, the government was not amused. Just 2 months later, Daumier and his publisher, Charles Philippon, were put on trial for insulting the king and encouraging contempt for the government. Daumier was found guilty and he spent nearly 6 months in prison. Governments had begun to fear caricatures almost as much as revolutionary pamphlets. Because unlike long political essays, a caricature crossed barriers that words could not. It didn't matter if someone couldn't read. It didn't matter what language they spoke. The message was immediate, universal. Impossible to unsee. Ironically, attempts to suppress caricature often made it even more popular. The more governments censored satirical artists, the more people wanted to see what had been forbidden. The image became a more powerful voice of the public. By the middle of the 19th century, caricature had become one of Europe's defining visual languages. Then another technological breakthrough changed everything once again. Lithography. Unlike traditional engraving, lithography allowed artists to reproduce images faster, cheaper, and in far greater numbers. Newspapers and illustrated magazines exploded in popularity. Satirical prints that once belonged mainly to wealthy collectors suddenly became affordable to ordinary workers and the growing middle class. Caricature was no longer confined to galleries or elite circles. It had become mass media. And across the Atlantic, American artists were paying close attention. One of them would use caricature not merely to ridicule politicians, but to help bring down one of the most powerful political machines in American history. His name was Thomas Nast. By the middle of the 19th century, caricature had conquered Europe. But across the Atlantic, it found something entirely new. A nation growing faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. America's population was exploding. Cities expanded almost overnight. Newspapers multiplied by the hundreds, and new printing technologies meant illustrated magazines could reach millions of readers for just a few cents. This was the perfect environment for caricature. Unlike Europe, Where many satirical prints were still sold individually, American caricatures increasingly appeared alongside the daily news. They weren't simply works of art anymore. They became part of journalism. And no one understood this better than one man: Thomas Nast. Born in Germany in 1840, Nast immigrated to the United States as a child. By his 20s, he was already drawing for Harper's Weekly, one of America's most influential illustrated newspapers. His drawings were funny, sometimes cruel, often unforgettable. But unlike many caricaturists before him, Nast wasn't interested only in making people laugh. At the time, New York City was effectively controlled by one of the most powerful political organizations in American history, Tammany Hall. Its most famous leader was William M. Tweed, better known simply as Boss Tweed. Officially, he held relatively ordinary public offices. Yet behind the scenes, he and his allies controlled elections, government contracts, public spending, and thousands of jobs through an enormous patronage network. The system became notorious for bribery, kickbacks, and the misuse of public funds. Newspapers reported the scandals. Investigators uncovered evidence. Politicians delivered speeches condemning the corruption. Yet for years, very little changed. Then Thomas Nast began drawing. Instead of publishing long editorials, he transformed Tweed into a symbol. A bloated figure wrapped in diamonds. A man whose enormous body seemed swollen with stolen wealth. A politician so consumed by greed that his appearance itself became an accusation. The cartoons spread everywhere. People pinned them to walls, displayed them in shop windows, passed them from hand to hand. According to a story often repeated by historians, Boss Tweed became increasingly frustrated, not because of newspaper articles, but because of Nast's pictures. Images reached audiences that words never could. Eventually, public outrage intensified. Investigations gained momentum. Tweed was arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. Corruption was exposed by journalists, prosecutors, political opponents, and reformers alike. But Nast gave the scandal a face. His caricatures made corruption visible. Even today, many of the symbols we associate with American politics can be traced back to his pen. The Republican elephant, the Democratic donkey, even the modern image of Santa Claus owes something to Nast's illustrations. His influence reached far beyond satire. By the 1850s, caricature had evolved into far more than entertainment. It had become a language, creating political symbols that survived for generations. Yet not every American caricaturist chose to wage war against politicians. Some turned their attention somewhere even more ambitious. Instead of transforming politicians into monsters, they transformed all of humanity into an entirely new branch of the animal kingdom. And no artist embraced that strange idea more brilliantly than Henry Louis Stevens. In 1851, Stevens published a peculiar little book with an even stranger title: The Comic Natural History of the Human Race. On its surface, it looked like a scientific field guide. Inside, nothing was what it seemed. By 1851, caricature had already proven it could embarrass kings, expose corruption, and influence public opinion. Henry Louis Stevens chose a different target: human nature itself. Stevens was born in Philadelphia in 1824, at a time when America was rapidly transforming. Railroads connected distant cities. Newspapers reached audiences larger than ever before. Scientific discoveries captured the public's imagination, and beautifully illustrated books became highly sought after by a growing middle class. As an illustrator, Stevens found himself at the center of this visual revolution. He was remarkably versatile. He produced illustrations for books and magazines, children's stories, and newspapers. But he became especially known for something else: his ability to draw animals with extraordinary personality. Not realistic animals. Expressive ones. Animals that seemed capable of thinking, scheming, laughing, and judging. It was a skill perfectly suited to caricature. Then, in 1851, Stevens collaborated with lithographer Max Rosenthal and publisher Samuel Robinson to produce one of the strangest illustrated books of the 19th century. Its title sounded completely respectable: The Comic Natural History of the Human Race. At first glance, the book resembles the scientific field guides that had become enormously popular during the Victorian era. Every page follows a familiar formula: an illustration, a species name, a description of its habitat, its behavior, its peculiar habits, its relationship with other species. It reads exactly like a zoological encyclopedia. Except, none of the species actually exist. Each creature has the body of an animal, and the unmistakable face of a human being. The joke is immediate, but the longer you look, the more sophisticated it becomes. Stevens wasn't merely attaching random heads to random animals. Every pairing was deliberate. Every species reflected a stereotype, a profession, a personality, or perhaps a real person hiding in plain sight. And that's where the mystery begins. Unlike many political caricatures of the period, the comic natural history of the human race rarely tells us exactly who these people are. Most entries avoid naming names. Instead, Stevens writes as though these creatures are genuine species waiting to be catalogued by science. Their behavior is described with complete seriousness. Their habitats are carefully recorded. Their temperaments are analyzed with the detached language of a naturalist. It's written with such confidence that, for a brief moment, you almost forget you're reading satire. That wasn't accidental. During the mid-19th century, natural history was immensely fashionable. Readers devoured lavishly illustrated books describing birds, mammals, insects, and exotic animals from around the globe. Classification had become an obsession. Scientists believed the natural world could be understood by carefully naming, organizing, and categorizing every living thing. Stevens borrowed that entire framework, only to turn it upside down. Instead of classifying animals, he classified people. Lawyers became birds. Actors became starfish. Criminals evolved into entirely separate species. The respectable language of science suddenly became a tool for comedy. It was a brilliant inversion of Victorian science, and perhaps an uncomfortable one. The more closely you read these entries, the less they resemble harmless jokes. They become observations about society itself. Who deserves admiration? Who deserves ridicule? Which professions benefit everyone, and which survive by exploiting others? Stevens never answers those questions directly. He lets the illustrations do the talking. And nearly 2 centuries later, we're still trying to identify the people hiding behind those faces. Some are obvious. Others remain educated guesses. So let's open this remarkable book and examine the evidence. Because every creature has a story, and every face may belong to someone history has almost forgotten. So who exactly are these creatures? That's where the comic natural history of the human race becomes especially fascinating. Unlike political cartoons that boldly named their targets, Henry Louis Stevens often left us with puzzles instead of answers. Many of the illustrations were almost certainly inspired by recognizable people living in Philadelphia and beyond. Yet in most cases, the book refuses to identify them directly. Instead, it invites the reader to play detective. Nearly 2 centuries later, we're still doing exactly that. Let's examine a few of the most intriguing specimens. The first creature appears graceful. Stevens names it the milliner bird. She has the head of a fashionable young woman, delicately placed upon the body of a bird. Her elaborate bonnet immediately catches the eye, decorated with ribbons and feathers in the latest Victorian style. A milliner was someone who designed and sold women's hats and fashionable accessories. Throughout the 19th century, real bird feathers, and sometimes entire stuffed birds, were enormously popular decorations for ladies' hats. Fashionable women proudly wore exotic plumage gathered from birds around the world. Stevens turns that trend into visual irony. Now that the milliner has become a bird, she might just be selling feathers out of its own body. It could almost be a clever observation about consumer culture. Fashion literally consumes nature until the distinction between the two disappears. Whether this illustration portrays a specific Philadelphia milliner remains unknown. Perhaps Stevens intentionally turned her face away, encouraging viewers to focus less on her identity and more on what she represents. Our next specimen is rather less refined. Stevens calls it the lark. We are presented with a man whose clothes are untidy. His collar hangs open. His cheeks are flushed. A bottle rests nearby, as if he's gobbled down more than a few drinks. His body belongs to a real bird, a lark, a small, brownish songbird known for its melodious songs, which it frequently sings while soaring in flight. But Stevens is making use of another meaning. By the 19th century, the word lark had also become slang for a carefree adventure, harmless prank, or a frivolous distraction. Suddenly, everything falls into place. This isn't simply a bird. It's a man devoted to pleasure, perhaps an entertainer, perhaps a street performer, perhaps someone whose cheerful public image hides a rather disorderly private life. The humor doesn't come from the animal. It comes from the collision between language and personality. Then we encounter one of Stevens' sharpest pieces of satire, the legal bird. Perched with all the dignity of a scientific illustration, the creature appears respectable, even distinguished. The accompanying description begins with mock seriousness. This bird is of very ancient origin. It's exactly how a natural historian might introduce an ancient species. But the text quickly reveals its true target. Stevens describes a creature that thrives on disputes. He's describing lawyers as though they have evolved to behave this way, as though endless argument isn't a professional choice, but an instinct. Some historians have suggested the face may resemble the Philadelphia lawyer and politician Richard Vose, a prominent public figure at the time. The resemblance is possible, but the satire works even if no specific individual was intended. The legal bird is less a portrait than an entire profession reduced to a species. One of the book's greatest puzzles is the king bird. Some people might think that this is a portrait of a king. The figure appears calm, confident, well-groomed hair and elegant gentleman's clothes. His posture resembles the formal portraits usually reserved for wealthy businessmen or civic leaders. Although the accompanying text hints another direction, printing. That detail has prompted some historians to wonder whether Stevens may have been alluding to Philadelphia printer Robert P. King, whose surname conveniently lends itself to the title. It's an attractive theory. In the 19th century, controlling a printing press could shape public opinion almost as effectively as holding political office. After all, the kingbird may represent anyone whose authority comes not from a crown, but from influence. And these are only a handful of the remarkable creatures inhabiting Stevens' imaginary ecosystem. A circus impresario becomes the humbug. A banker transforms into a goldfish. Politicians, businessmen, performers, and socialites all evolve into species perfectly adapted to their own peculiar environment. Nearly 2 centuries after Henry Louis Stevens published the comic Natural History of the Human Race, the world has changed beyond recognition. Photography replaced portrait painting. Television replaced illustrated newspapers. The internet replaced nearly everything that came before it. And yet, caricature never disappeared. If anything, it became even more powerful. Every election season, editorial cartoonists still exaggerate politicians' faces to make a point before readers even glance at the headline. Online, memes do exactly the same thing. A familiar photograph is stretched, distorted, or paired with a clever caption, reducing a complicated event into a single image that millions of people instantly understand. The technology has changed. The visual language has not. Why does it work so well? Part of the answer lies in how we recognize faces. Our brains don't memorize every detail equally. Instead, they pay special attention to the features that make one face different from another. A distinctive hairstyle, a broad jaw, heavy eyebrows, a prominent nose, an unusual smile. A skilled caricaturist identifies those features and pushes them just beyond reality. Strangely, the result often becomes even easier to recognize than a realistic portrait. But caricature has always been about more than recognition. Its real subject is human behavior. Greed, vanity, ambition, pride, and pretension. Those qualities don't belong to one century or one country. They belong to us. That's why Stevens' imaginary creatures still feel surprisingly familiar. The legal bird still thrives wherever arguments become profitable. The milliner bird reminds us that fashion and consumption can reshape the natural world. The starfish reflects a culture fascinated by celebrity. Even the jailbird raises uncomfortable questions about crime, punishment, and whether society defines people by what they've done or by who they might become. The names behind the faces may have faded, but the personalities remain instantly recognizable. Perhaps that's the greatest achievement of caricature. It captures something that ordinary portraits rarely can. A photograph records what someone looked like on a particular day. A caricature attempts to capture how the world remembers them. Henry Louis Stevens understood this better than most. His book wasn't really about birds or fish, or insects. It wasn't even about the famous people hiding behind those faces. It was about the absurdity of trying to classify human nature. Scientists of the 19th century believed they could organize the natural world by placing every living creature into neat categories. And satire has a remarkable way of surviving long after the events that inspired it. Many of the public figures mocked by Stevens have been forgotten. The scandals that once filled newspapers have faded into history. Yet the illustrations continue to make us smile, not because we recognize every face, but because we recognize ourselves. Perhaps that's why caricature has survived for more than 400 years. Not because it exaggerates the way people look, but because it exaggerates the parts of ourselves we'd rather not admit are there. And maybe that's why the most dangerous joke in history was never really a joke at all.